Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Sierra Nevada history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are hearing this narration. We are interested to know to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1852, when the California gold rush had transformed the Sierra Nevada foothills into a labyrinth of mining camps and makeshift settlements, a peculiar discovery was made in what is now known as Hangtown Gulch, approximately 15 miles southeast of Placerville. A prospector named Thomas Mackenzie, working his claim along a tributary of the American River, unearthed something that would challenge everything the local community thought they knew about human nature and the bonds that tie people together. Mackenzie had been digging for nearly 3 months when his pickaxe struck what he initially believed to be a vein of quartz. Instead, he found a wooden box, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. Inside the box were 47 letters, written in 2 distinct hands, along with a daguerreotype of a young woman and a man's pocket watch inscribed with the initials H.W. The letters, dated between March and September of 1852, documented what appeared to be a correspondence between 2 individuals identified only as "My dearest L" and "Beloved H." The discovery would have remained a curiosity, perhaps fodder for campfire stories, had it not been for the arrival of Reverend Augustus Belmont in December of that same year. Belmont, a Methodist minister from Sacramento, had come to Hangtown Gulch to establish a proper church for the growing mining community. When he examined the letters, his face reportedly went pale, and he immediately requested a private meeting with the local magistrate, Judge William Hensley. What Belmont had recognized in those carefully preserved pages was handwriting that matched entries in the church registry books from his previous posting in Nevada City, some 50 miles northeast of Placerville. The feminine script belonged to someone he had married just 6 months earlier, Lucinda Pratt, age 23, daughter of a Methodist circuit rider who had died crossing the plains in 1849. The masculine hand belonged to Henry Whitlock, aged 31, a former merchant from Ohio who had arrived in California in 1851, with little more than the clothes on his back and an unwavering determination to strike it rich. But Lucinda Pratt had not married Henry Whitlock. According to Belmont's records, she had married a man named Jonathan Caldwell, a blacksmith who operated a forge in Nevada City. The ceremony had taken place on June 14, 1852, in the presence of 12 witnesses, including Caldwell's business partner and Lucinda's only remaining family, an aunt named Margaret Pratt. The letters told a different story entirely. In the earliest correspondence, dated March 18, 1852, the woman identified as L wrote of meeting H at a church social in Nevada City. She described him as a gentleman of refined manner and uncommon intelligence, whose eyes hold depths that speak of both great sorrow and greater hope. The letter went on to detail secret meetings along Deer Creek, conversations that lasted until dawn, and a growing affection that she described as unlike anything the good Lord has seen fit to bless me with before. Henry's responses, written in a careful, educated hand, revealed a man grappling with circumstances that the letters only hinted at. In one dated April 2nd, he wrote, "My circumstances remain unchanged, dearest Lucinda, though each day brings new possibilities. I have written to my associates in Sacramento regarding the matter we discussed, but no reply has yet arrived. Until then, we must continue to meet as we have been, though it pains me to see you forced into these deceptions for my sake." The magistrate, Judge Hensley, was a practical man who had seen his share of mining camp melodramas. Gold fever brought out both the best and worst in people, and tales of abandoned families, false identities, and passionate affairs were common enough. What troubled him about the Pratt-Whitlock correspondence was not the affair itself, But the meticulous planning evident in the letters and the fact that the box had been buried with such care. Someone had intended for these documents to be found, but not immediately. A careful examination of the burial site revealed that the ground had been disturbed twice. The original burial appeared to have taken place in late September, based on the condition of the soil and the presence of autumn leaves that had been compressed beneath the box. But someone had returned in November, just weeks before Mackenzie's discovery, and disturbed the earth above the hiding place. Whether this second disturbance was intentional or accidental remained unclear, but it had caused the box to shift upward, making it vulnerable to Mackenzie's prospecting efforts. Judge Hensley's investigation began with a trip to Nevada City to interview Reverend Belmont and examine the church records more carefully. What he found there deepened the mystery considerably. Lucinda Pratt's marriage to Jonathan Caldwell had indeed taken place as recorded, but several witnesses from the ceremony described the bride's behavior as peculiar and distant. Margaret Pratt, Lucinda's aunt, had reportedly attempted to postpone the wedding twice, citing her niece's delicate constitution and need for more time to prepare. Jonathan Caldwell himself proved to be a straightforward man, whose account of his courtship with Lucinda raised more questions than it answered. He had met her in May of 1852 at the same church social where, according to the letters, she had encountered Henry Whitlock. Caldwell described their relationship as proper and conducted with all due respect for her mourning period. He explained that Lucinda's father had died only 2 years earlier, and she had been living with her aunt while helping to establish a school for the children of local miners. The courtship, according to Caldwell, had progressed rapidly. Within 3 weeks of their first meeting, he had requested permission from Margaret Pratt to court her niece formally. The aunt had given her consent, though Caldwell noted that she seemed troubled by considerations she would not share. The engagement had been announced in early June, with the wedding following just 2 weeks later. When Judge Hensley asked about Lucinda's demeanor during their courtship and early marriage, Caldwell's responses revealed a pattern that would become central to understanding the events that followed. She was always proper, he explained, but there were times when she seemed to be listening for something or someone that was not there. During our conversations, she would sometimes pause mid-sentence and look toward the door or window, as though expecting a visitor who never arrived. Caldwell also mentioned that Lucinda had requested permission to take long walks alone, usually in the afternoons when his work at the forge kept him occupied. She claimed these walks helped with her nervous condition, a malady that her aunt confirmed had troubled her since her father's death. The walks typically took her along Deer Creek, the same location mentioned repeatedly in her correspondence with Henry Whitlock. The search for Henry Whitlock proved more challenging than expected. No one in Nevada City could recall a man matching his description despite the detailed accounts in Lucinda's letters. Church records contained no mention of him, nor did the local merchant registry or boarding house logs. It was as though Henry Whitlock had existed only in the pages of the buried correspondence and in Lucinda's carefully guarded memories. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the daguerreotype found in the buried box, Judge Hensley noticed something that previous observers had missed. In the background of the formal portrait, barely visible behind the posed figures of the young woman and the well-dressed man, was a sign that read, "Morrison's Photographic Studio, Sacramento." The judge immediately dispatched his deputy, Samuel Torres, to locate the studio and determine when the photograph had been taken. Morrison's studio had burned down in a fire the previous August, but the photographer, Edmund Morrison, had salvaged many of his glass plate negatives and was operating out of temporary quarters near the Sacramento waterfront. Morrison examined the daguerreotype and confirmed that it had been produced in his studio, but not recently. Based on the chemicals used and the style of mounting, he estimated the photograph had been taken sometime in 1850 or 1851, well before the dates of the correspondence found in the box. More importantly, Morrison recognized the subjects. The woman was indeed Lucinda Pratt, though she appeared younger in the photograph than she would have been in 1852. The man, however, was not someone Morrison had photographed in his studio. "This gentleman's image has been added to the plate," Morrison explained to Deputy Torres. "It's skilled work, but if you examine the shadows carefully, you can see that the light falls differently on each figure. They were never in my studio at the same time." This revelation forced Judge Hensley to reconsider everything he thought he understood about the case. If the photograph had been altered, what did that suggest about the authenticity of the letters? And if Henry Whitlock was not who he claimed to be in the correspondence, then who was Lucinda Pratt really writing to during those secret afternoon meetings along Deer Creek? The answer began to emerge when Margaret Pratt, Lucinda's aunt, requested a private meeting with Judge Hensley in late January of 1853. Margaret was a woman in her 50s who had never married and had devoted her life to caring for her brother's family after their mother died in childbirth. She had taken responsibility for Lucinda after her father's death and had been the only family member present at the wedding to Jonathan Caldwell. Margaret's account of her niece's behavior in the months leading up to the marriage painted a picture of a young woman struggling with grief in ways that her community was not equipped to understand or address. "Lucinda had always been imaginative," Margaret explained, "but after her father's passing she began to spend hours writing in a journal that she kept hidden beneath her mattress. When I discovered it accidentally while cleaning her room, I found page after page of conversations with her deceased father." The journal entries Margaret described bore striking similarities to the letters found in the buried box. Lucinda had written detailed accounts of meeting her father in various locations around Nevada City, describing his appearance, their conversations, and his advice regarding her future. The writing was so vivid and specific that Margaret had initially wondered if her niece might indeed be encountering some supernatural presence, despite her Methodist upbringing's prohibition against such beliefs. But as Margaret observed her niece more closely, she began to notice a pattern. Lucinda's meetings with her father always occurred during her solitary walks, particularly along Deer Creek, where the two of them had often gone fishing during her childhood. When she returned from these walks, she would immediately retreat to her room and spend hours writing in her journal, often emerging for dinner with her eyes red from crying, but her demeanor strangely peaceful. Margaret had consulted with Reverend Belmont about her concerns, and together they had decided that marriage to a stable, reliable man like Jonathan Caldwell might provide the structure and companionship Lucinda needed to overcome her grief and return to a more conventional relationship with reality. The rapid courtship had been orchestrated with this goal in mind. Though neither Margaret nor the Reverend had shared their concerns with Caldwell himself. Judge Hensley's investigation took on a new dimension as he considered the possibility that the letters represented not a secret affair with a mysterious stranger, but rather a young woman's elaborate correspondence with her own grief and longing. The careful burial of the letters suggested a ritual of letting go, perhaps encouraged by well-meaning family members who believed that Lucinda needed to put aside childish things in order to embrace her role as a wife. But this theory raised new questions about the events that had transpired after Lucinda's marriage to Jonathan Caldwell. If the letters had been buried in September of 1852, just 3 months after the wedding, what had prompted this action? And why had someone returned to the burial site in November, shortly before the box's discovery? The answers to these questions emerged gradually through interviews with members of the Nevada City community who had observed Lucinda's behavior during the early months of her marriage. Several neighbors reported that she had continued her afternoon walks along Deer Creek, despite her husband's growing discomfort with these solitary excursions. Sarah Hutchins, who operated a boarding house near the creek, mentioned that she had occasionally seen Lucinda sitting alone on a fallen log, appearing to carry on animated conversations with someone who was not visible to outside observers. More troubling were reports from children who played near the creek and claimed to have overheard portions of these one-sided conversations. 8-year-old Timothy Ross told his mother that the pretty lady by the creek often spoke about going away and keeping promises in a voice that alternated between pleading and angry. When his mother questioned him more closely, Timothy added that the lady sometimes cried and sometimes laughed, but always ended her visits by placing something small in a hole she had dug near the water's edge. Judge Hensley's examination of the creek area revealed several small, disturbed patches of earth, each roughly the size of a man's hand. When excavated, these sites yielded a collection of personal items that appeared to belong to Lucinda: a locket containing a miniature portrait of her father, several hair ribbons, a small leather-bound book of psalms, and a wooden thimble that Margaret Pratt identified as having belonged to Lucinda's mother. The pattern suggested a gradual process of burial, with Lucinda interring objects one at a time over the course of several months. The items all held sentimental value related to her family or her life before marriage, suggesting that she was systematically laying to rest the aspects of her identity that she felt could no longer coexist with her new role as Jonathan Caldwell's wife. The letters, then, represented the culmination of this process. In her correspondence with the fictional Henry Whitlock, Lucinda had created a space where she could express feelings and desires that her real life no longer permitted. The character of Henry embodied everything that her actual marriage lacked: intellectual stimulation, emotional understanding, and the freedom to be herself without the constraints imposed by community expectations and social propriety. The sophisticated nature of the letters, with their careful attention to historical details and their realistic portrayal of mining camp life, demonstrated Lucinda's remarkable intelligence and creativity. She had crafted not just a fantasy romance, but an entire alternate reality, complete with believable characters, plausible circumstances, and emotionally authentic dialogue. The fact that she had chosen to preserve these letters in such an elaborate manner suggested that she understood their value as both personal expression and artistic achievement. Jonathan Caldwell's reaction to Judge Hensley's findings revealed the depth of his own isolation within his marriage to Lucinda. When presented with excerpts from the letters, he initially expressed anger and disbelief, but gradually began to acknowledge signs he had previously ignored or misinterpreted. "She always seemed to be somewhere else," he admitted during his final interview with the judge. "Even when she was sitting right beside me, her thoughts were traveling paths I could not follow." Caldwell described evenings when Lucinda would stare out their cabin window toward Deer Creek with an expression he could only characterize as longing. When he asked what she was thinking about, she would smile and claim to be just wool gathering. But he sensed that her thoughts were far more specific and directed than such casual daydreaming would suggest. The marriage had become increasingly strained as Lucinda's afternoon walks grew longer and more frequent. Caldwell had attempted to accompany her several times, but these joint expeditions always ended in awkward silence, with Lucinda clearly uncomfortable and eager to return home. He had begun to suspect that she was meeting someone in secret, but his attempts to follow her had revealed only the solitary conversations that neighbors had also observed. The discovery of the letters provided Caldwell with answers he was not sure he wanted. The realization that his wife had been conducting an elaborate romantic correspondence with an imaginary lover was both a relief and a source of profound sadness. It confirmed that there was no actual rival for her affections, but it also revealed the extent to which she had needed to escape from their shared reality in order to find emotional satisfaction. Margaret Pratt's response to the revelation was more complex. She had suspected that her niece's grief was manifesting in unusual ways, but she had not anticipated the sophistication and intensity of the fantasy world Lucinda had constructed. The letters demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that challenged conventional understanding of how young women should cope with loss and adjustment to marriage. More troubling to Margaret was the realization that her well-intentioned efforts to provide Lucinda with stability and normalcy had inadvertently forced her niece into a position where elaborate deception seemed like the only path to emotional survival. The rapid courtship and marriage that Margaret had orchestrated with Reverend Belmont's blessing had ignored Lucinda's actual emotional needs in favor of what the community deemed appropriate for a young woman in her circumstances. The question of what had prompted Lucinda to bury the letters in September remained unanswered until Deputy Torres discovered a letter from Margaret Pratt to Reverend Belmont, dated September 20th, 1852. In this correspondence, Margaret expressed growing concern about her niece's behavior and requested the Reverend's advice about measures that might be taken to redirect her thoughts toward more appropriate channels. The letter revealed that Margaret had discovered the existence of Lucinda's correspondence, though she had not examined it closely enough to understand its fictional nature. Believing that her niece was indeed engaged in a secret affair, Margaret had confronted Lucinda and demanded that she end the relationship immediately. The burial of the letters appeared to have been Lucinda's response to this ultimatum, a symbolic gesture of compliance that allowed her to preserve her written fantasy while appearing to accede to her aunt's demands. But Lucinda's compliance proved to be temporary. According to Jonathan Caldwell's later testimony, his wife's behavior became increasingly erratic in the weeks following the burial of the letters. She abandoned her walks along Deer Creek, but began spending hours standing at their cabin window, staring in the direction of the burial site. She ate little, slept poorly, and showed no interest in the household tasks that had previously occupied her time. In early November, Caldwell had awakened one night to find Lucinda's side of the bed empty. When he searched for her, he discovered that she had left the cabin wearing only her nightgown and was walking barefoot toward Deer Creek. He followed her to the burial site, where he found her digging frantically in the earth with her bare hands, apparently attempting to recover the buried box. Caldwell's account of this incident provided crucial insight into Lucinda's state of mind during her final weeks in Nevada City. When he approached her, she initially did not seem to recognize him, addressing him as Henry and asking why he had taken so long to come for her. Her hands were bleeding from her digging efforts, but she seemed unaware of her injuries, focused entirely on her attempt to unearth the letters that represented her last connection to the emotional world she had been forced to abandon. Caldwell managed to lead her back to the cabin, but the incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Lucinda's episodes of confusion became more frequent, and she began to speak openly about Henry Whitlock as though he were a real person who would soon be arriving to take her away from Nevada City. Her conversations with this imaginary figure took place not only during solitary moments, but also during meals with her husband and visits from her aunt. The community's response to Lucinda's deteriorating condition reflected the limited understanding of mental distress that characterized frontier life in the 1850s. Margaret Pratt consulted with the local physician, Dr. Ezra Morton, who prescribed rest, frequent prayers, and a diet free of stimulating substances such as coffee and tea. Reverend Belmont recommended intensive Bible study and increased participation in church activities as remedies for what he characterized as spiritual waywardness. None of these interventions proved effective. Lucinda's grip on consensual reality continued to weaken, and her identification with the fictional world she had created became more complete. She began signing her name as Mrs. Henry Whitlock, and referred to Jonathan Caldwell as her temporary guardian, who was caring for her until her real husband could claim her. The final entry in Judge Hensley's case file, dated December 15, 1852, recorded the circumstances of Lucinda's disappearance from Nevada City. According to multiple witnesses, she had attended Sunday morning church services on December 12th, but her behavior during the service had been unusual enough to attract attention. Rather than joining in the hymns and prayers, she had spent the entire service writing in a small notebook, occasionally pausing to look around the congregation as though searching for someone. After the service concluded, Lucinda had approached several community members to inform them that she would soon be leaving Nevada City to join her husband in Sacramento. When reminded that her husband was Jonathan Caldwell and that he was standing directly beside her, she had laughed and explained that there had been a terrible misunderstanding that would soon be corrected. She had then walked calmly out of the church, despite her aunt's attempts to detain her. That afternoon, Margaret Pratt and Jonathan Caldwell had discovered that Lucinda had packed a small traveling bag and left a note explaining that she had gone to meet Henry at the stagecoach station for their journey to Sacramento. The note, written in the same careful hand as the buried letters, expressed gratitude for their care during her temporary separation from her true husband, and assured them that she would write once she was settled in her new home. A search of the stagecoach station and the roads leading out of Nevada City revealed no trace of Lucinda Pratt. The stagecoach drivers who had been working that day confirmed that no woman matching her description had purchased passage or been seen in the vicinity of the station. Local miners and travelers who had been questioned reported no sightings of a young woman traveling alone on any of the area's roads or trails. Judge Hensley's investigation into Lucinda's disappearance continued for several months, but yielded no concrete evidence of what had become of her. The terrain surrounding Nevada City was treacherous, particularly in winter, and it was entirely possible that she'd become lost and perished from exposure. Alternative theories suggested that she might have made her way to Sacramento or San Francisco, where a young woman could disappear into the anonymous crowds that characterized California's rapidly growing cities. The discovery of the second disturbance at the burial site in November suggested that Lucinda had indeed returned to recover the letters before her disappearance. This possibility was supported by the fact that when Thomas Mackenzie had found the box, it had been partially unearthed, as though someone had begun the process of excavation, but had been interrupted before completing the task. If Lucinda had recovered the letters, it would explain her confidence about meeting Henry Whitlock at the stagecoach station. In her deteriorating mental state, the physical possession of the correspondence might have seemed like proof of their relationship's reality, evidence that she could present to skeptical observers who questioned her claims about her true husband's existence. The broader implications of the Pratt-Whitlock case extended beyond the personal tragedy of one young woman's psychological collapse. Judge Hensley's final report noted that Lucinda's story highlighted the inadequacy of available resources for individuals struggling with grief, trauma, and mental distress in frontier communities. The emphasis on conformity and social stability that characterized these settlements often left no room for alternative approaches to healing and recovery. Margaret Pratt's well-intentioned efforts to help her niece had been based on conventional wisdom that emphasized the importance of marriage and community integration as solutions to personal difficulties. The rapid courtship and wedding that she had orchestrated with Reverend Belmont's support reflected widely held beliefs about the stabilizing influence of domestic responsibility on women who were perceived as emotionally fragile. But Lucinda's response to these interventions demonstrated the dangers of ignoring individual psychological needs in favor of social expectations. Her creation of an elaborate fantasy world represented both a remarkable creative achievement and a desperate attempt to preserve her sense of self in circumstances that offered no legitimate outlet for her intellectual and emotional complexity. The sophistication of the letters, with their detailed characterizations and realistic dialogue, suggested that Lucinda possessed literary talents that her community was neither equipped to recognize nor prepared to nurture. In a different environment, with access to education and creative outlets, she might have channeled her imaginative gifts into socially acceptable forms of expression. Instead, the constraints of her circumstances had forced her to pursue these interests in secret, ultimately contributing to her isolation from the very community that was supposed to provide support and stability. The fictional Henry Whitlock had become more real to her than the actual people in her life because he offered what they could not: intellectual companionship, emotional understanding, and acceptance of her true nature. Jonathan Caldwell's experience as the unwitting husband in this complex situation also revealed the limitations of traditional gender roles and expectations in frontier society. His assumption that marriage would naturally provide emotional satisfaction for both partners had blinded him to signs that his wife's needs were not being met through conventional domestic arrangements. The fact that Lucinda had been able to conduct her elaborate correspondence for months without her husband's awareness suggested a degree of emotional distance between them that neither partner had acknowledged or addressed. Caldwell's focus on providing financial stability and social respectability had left him unprepared to recognize or respond to his wife's psychological distress. In the years following Lucinda's disappearance, the case became a subject of discussion and debate throughout the Sierra Nevada mining region. Some community members interpreted her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive imagination and the importance of accepting one's designated social role. Others saw it as evidence of the need for more compassionate approaches to mental distress and greater recognition of women's intellectual capabilities. Reverend Belmont, whose involvement in arranging the marriage had contributed to the tragic outcome, began to advocate for more gradual approaches to courtship and marriage, particularly for individuals who had experienced significant loss or trauma. His later sermons emphasized the importance of understanding and patience in family relationships, reflecting his recognition that his previous interventions had been inadequately informed about human psychology and emotional development. Margaret Pratt spent the remainder of her life wondering whether different choices on her part might have prevented her niece's disappearance. She became an advocate for women's education and established a small school in Nevada City that offered instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic for girls whose families might not otherwise have provided such opportunities. This work represented her attempt to ensure that other young women would have legitimate outlets for their intellectual abilities. The physical remnants of the case gradually disappeared as the mining camps evolved into more permanent settlements. The cabin where Lucinda and Jonathan had lived was eventually demolished to make way for a larger building, and Deer Creek was diverted as part of hydraulic mining operations that transformed the local landscape. The burial site where the letters had been hidden was obliterated, leaving no physical trace of the elaborate ritual that had marked the end of Lucinda's fantasy world. But the questions raised by the Pratt-Whitlock correspondence continued to resonate through changing understanding of mental health, women's rights, and social responsibility. The case highlighted the tragic consequences that could result when individual psychological needs conflicted with community expectations, and when creative intelligence was forced to operate in secret rather than being recognized and nurtured. Thomas Mackenzie, the prospector whose discovery had brought the case to light, eventually sold his claim and moved to Oregon. But he carried with him a lasting impression of the letters' emotional power and literary sophistication. In later years, he would describe them as some of the most moving personal documents he had ever encountered, evidence of a remarkable mind trapped in circumstances that offered no legitimate expression for its capabilities. Judge Hensley's final notation in the case file, written in March of 1853, reflected his recognition that the legal system was inadequately equipped to address the complex human issues that the investigation had revealed. "The law provides remedies for crimes of action," he wrote, "but offers little guidance for addressing crimes of neglect or misunderstanding that may be equally destructive to human welfare." The case file was eventually transferred to the California State Archives, where it remained largely forgotten until 1868, when a graduate student at the University of California discovered it while researching frontier marriage customs. The student, Helen Morrison, was struck by the quality of Lucinda's writing and the sophistication of her psychological portrait of the fictional Henry Whitlock. Morrison's thesis, completed in 1869, argued that the Pratt-Whitlock correspondence represented an early example of American women's literary achievement that had been overlooked because of its unconventional form and tragic circumstances. She noted that Lucinda's creation of a fully realized fictional character and her ability to sustain a complex narrative over several months demonstrated talents that would have been remarkable in any context. But Morrison's academic analysis, while recognizing the literary merit of the letters, could not address the fundamental questions about Lucinda's fate that continued to haunt those who studied the case. Had she indeed perished somewhere in the Sierra Nevada wilderness, another victim of the harsh conditions that claimed so many 49ers and their families? Or had she somehow managed to create a new life for herself, perhaps in one of California's growing cities, where her past could be forgotten and her abilities might find more appropriate expression? The answer to these questions remained elusive, buried as deeply as the letters themselves had been in the autumn earth of 1852. What survived was the testament to one woman's refusal to accept the limitations that her circumstances had attempted to impose on her imagination and her heart, even when that refusal ultimately led to her disappearance from the conventional world that had proved incapable of containing her true nature. In the end, the most bizarre aspect of the romance between Lucinda Pratt and Henry Whitlock was not its fictional nature, but rather the fact that it represented a love more authentic and emotionally satisfying than the real relationships available to her in the gold rush society of the Sierra Nevada. Through her correspondence with an imaginary lover, she had achieved an intimacy and understanding that eluded her in her actual marriage and family connections. The letters stood as evidence that human creativity and the need for emotional connection could transcend the boundaries of reality when those boundaries became too restrictive to sustain the spirit. Whether Lucinda Pratt found the freedom she sought beyond the confines of Nevada City, or whether she paid the ultimate price for her refusal to accept a life that denied her true nature, her story remains a testament to the power of imagination to create meaning in circumstances that offer little hope for authentic expression. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most important truth to emerge from the strange case discovered in Hangtown Gulch during that long-ago autumn. That love, even imaginary love, represents a form of resistance against forces that seek to diminish human complexity and reduce people to the narrow roles that society deems appropriate for their circumstances. The correspondence between Lucinda Pratt and Henry Whitlock continues to raise questions about the nature of reality, the purpose of imagination, and the price we pay when creative intelligence is forced to operate in darkness, rather than being welcomed into the light of recognition and support. These questions remain as relevant today as they were in the mining camps of 1852, reminding us that the human need for authentic connection and meaningful expression transcends time, place, and circumstance. Years would pass before anyone would again disturb the earth along that forgotten stretch of Deer Creek, and by then the California gold rush would be remembered as a distant chapter in the state's transformation from wilderness to civilization. But somewhere in the archives and in the memories of those who had known her, Lucinda Pratt's voice would continue to speak through her carefully preserved letters, offering testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love to create meaning in even the most constraining circumstances. The most bizarre romance in Sierra Nevada history had been conducted entirely in the realm of imagination, but its impact on those who discovered it proved all too real, forcing them to confront questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the tragic consequences that can result when authentic expression is denied legitimate outlets. In that sense, Lucinda Pratt's correspondence with Henry Whitlock achieved a kind of immortality that transcended the physical world in which it was created, becoming part of the larger human conversation about love, loss, and the eternal struggle between individual needs and social expectations. The discovery at Hangtown Gulch would claim one final victim before the case could be considered truly closed. In April of 1853, Thomas Mackenzie, the prospector who had first unearthed the buried correspondence, was found dead in his cabin, apparently having taken his own life. Beside his body lay a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be a confession written in a shaking hand. "I have carried this burden too long," Mackenzie had written. "The letters were never buried where I claimed to find them. I discovered them in Lucinda's traveling bag beside Deer Creek in December, 3 days after Christmas. She was there too, frozen beneath the ice where the creek bends near the old mining claim. I moved her body and buried the letters where I said I found them because I could not bear for them to read her final words." Mackenzie's confession revealed that Lucinda Pratt had indeed perished in the Sierra Nevada wilderness, but not in the manner that Judge Hensley's investigation had assumed. According to the prospector's account, she had survived for nearly 2 weeks after leaving Nevada City, sustained by the fantasy that Henry Whitlock was waiting for her in Sacramento. When the harsh reality of her situation finally broke through her delusions, she had chosen to end her life rather than return to a world that offered no place for her true self. The final letter in the correspondence, which Mackenzie had kept hidden until his death, was addressed to Henry, but clearly written with the understanding that he would never read it. In this last communication, Lucinda acknowledged the fictional nature of their relationship, while asserting that the emotions she had experienced were more real than anything her actual life had offered. "My dearest and most beloved creation," she had written, "I know now that you exist only in these pages and in my heart, but that knowledge does not diminish what we have shared. Through you, I have learned what it means to be truly known and accepted. If I cannot live in a world that has room for such understanding, then I choose to die believing that somewhere, in some realm beyond this one, you are waiting for me as I have waited for you." Judge Hensley ordered Mackenzie's confession sealed and the case officially closed, recognizing that no purpose would be served by revealing the full truth about Lucinda's fate to her surviving family members. Jonathan Caldwell and Margaret Pratt were informed that evidence had been discovered confirming her death, but the specific circumstances were withheld to spare them additional anguish. The letters themselves were quietly transferred to the California State Archives, where they would remain largely forgotten for more than a century. When they were finally rediscovered in the 1960s by researchers studying frontier women's experiences, they were recognized as remarkable documents of psychological complexity and literary achievement, evidence of a brilliant mind trapped in circumstances that offered no legitimate outlet for its capabilities. Today, the site where Hangtown Gulch once thrived lies beneath a modern shopping center, and Deer Creek flows through concrete channels that bear no resemblance to the wilderness where Lucinda Pratt once sought refuge in conversations with her imaginary beloved. But her letters survive as testament to the enduring power of human creativity to transcend even the most constraining circumstances, creating meaning and connection where none existed before. The most bizarre romance in Sierra Nevada gold rush history was conducted entirely between a real woman and a fictional man, yet it generated emotions and insights that proved more authentic than many conventional relationships of its time. In choosing to preserve her correspondence and ultimately to die rather than abandon her fantasy, Lucinda Pratt demonstrated that some aspects of human experience transcend the boundaries between imagination and reality, offering truths that conventional wisdom cannot accommodate or understand. Her story remains a haunting reminder that love, in all its forms, represents a fundamental human need that will find expression even under the most impossible circumstances, and that the price of denying authentic connection can be measured not just in individual tragedy, but in the loss of creative potential that might otherwise have enriched the broader community. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy was not that Lucinda Pratt loved someone who did not exist, but that the world in which she lived could not recognize or nurture the remarkable intelligence that created Henry Whitlock and sustained their extraordinary correspondence through the final months of her brief and troubled life.